Now, in this video, we will understand what Pi interface is and its important components. Then we will go ahead and install the Pi interface configuration utility and Pi interface for OPC-DA. And finally, we will briefly discuss the general steps to fully install and configure any Pi interface. There are about 400 plus Pi interfaces that can gather data from different kinds of data sources. In general, Pi interface is nothing but a program that runs on a specific node, and it needs to be configured to communicate and gather data from the data source and send the data to the Pi data archive. In general, the Pi interfaces contain two different components, namely the associated executable file, this one, that runs the Pi interface, and the executable uses the so-called batch file. The batch file contains specific information the program actually requires for its operation, such as the name of the data source and its node name of the Pi data archive to send the data to, and other configuration information. Finally, in order to configure the Pi interface, we require another application, which is called Pi Interface Configuration Utility, Pi ICU in short. This application comes along with two different kinds of applications, namely the Pi SDK and Pi API, which are two possible connection mechanisms that can be utilized to establish communication with the Pi data archive. In general, we perform the following steps to install and configure any Pi interface. We need to run the install kits to install the Pi ICU, which stands for Pi Interface Configuration Utility, and Pi Interface. In this case, we installed Pi Interface for OPC-DA. Then we set up the necessary security. We will perform some pre-configuration checks. Then we will configure the Pi Interface instance using the batch file through the ICU and verify the startup process, wherein we need to run it interactively. Then we create the Windows service for the Pi interface for OPC-DA. Then we create the necessary Pi points, and finally we configure the buffering. Now let's run the installation kits for installing Pi Interface Configuration Utility, Pi OPC-DA Interface, and API 2016. It should be mentioned that OSIsoft introduced API 2016, which enables interfaces to connect to Pi data archive in a more secure manner rather than using PiTrust. Also, it should be noted that it is always recommended when possible to install OSIsoft components on a separate drive, as C drive is recommended to be vested only for the operating system. So in our case, we will install all the components on the E drive. So kindly go to the machine Pi INT1, which is the designated interface machine, and you will find a folder called course folder on the desktop. Open the folder, and within that you will have a folder called install kits. Kindly open that. Here you will find three installation kits, namely one for Pi Interface Configuration Utility, Pi API 2016 for Windows Integrated Security, and OPC interface. So let's start with Pi ICU. Right click on Pi ICU and select Run as Administrator. Accept the defaults and click OK. Select OK. Here, kindly change the path from C drive to E drive. To install both 32-bit version of Pi PC components as well as 64-bit version of all OSIsoft components into the Pi PC folder. Click Next. Here we include the name of the Pi data archive server to where we need to send the data to, which is in our case Pi SRP1. and then select Next. Now select Next to start all these services. And we are done with now the installation of interface configuration utility. Select Close. And now let's install API 2016 for Windows Integrated Security. Similarly to how we install Pi ICU, right-click on Pi API 2016 and select Run as Administrator. Accept the default and hit OK. And here we accept the conditions and select Install. Now we basically install those API components as well as Pi network subsystem support and select OK. Now we select Next. So all the services can be stopped and restarted once the installation is complete. Select Next so that we can finish the installation of Pi API 2016. Everything is complete, and select Close. Now lastly, we will install Pi interface component, which is Pi OPC DA. Right click on OPC int read only and select Run as Administrator. Here to accept the default and select OK. So it basically says what are the components which are going to be installed. So accept the default and hit OK. Now we select Next so that it can stop all these services and get it restarted once the installation is complete. Click Next, and we are done. So right now we install Pi ICU API 2016, which enables the use of Windows Integrated Security for the interfaces to connect securely to the Pi Data Archive, and lastly the Pi OPC DA interface. Now that we have installed the necessary components on the designated Pi interface node, namely PyInt1, let's navigate to the installation folder location. So let's go to C, Program Files x86, PyPC, Interfaces, OPCInt. As discussed at the beginning of the video, we have the two important components, namely the executable file and the associated batch file. This is a sample batch file which is provided, and this can be utilized to configure the instance of Pi interface for OPC DA. We would also note that the documentation associated with this version of Pi interface for OPC DA is also available for your reference as well.